Good day. Welcome to the Bible and Modern Science, Class 29. This is our last dance. Last chance you get to ask the questions that you didn't want to ask before, but that you need the answer to. What I'm going to do today is finish up some work that we've started on NOMA, the conceptual way of dealing with science and religion that has been presented by Stephen J. Gould. And then we're going to do a little review of what this class has been all about. But the first thing I'd like to do, I've already told you I don't know how many times, how many books there are available on this subject. And if your interest has been piqued a little bit, you might want to do some reading the rest of this year or over the summer. And let me just give you a few possibilities here. One is a book that I've been using the last couple of sessions called Mere Creation, which is a book on science, faith, and intelligent design, edited by William Dembski, whom we've mentioned a few times. But the reason why this might be the book to get on the intelligent design movement is because it includes most of the people involved in the intelligent design movement in essay form. And so if you want to get an overall view of how many different ways there are to approach the design movement, then that might be a good book to look at. If you're looking for a fight, then one of the best places to go is a book by Philip Johnson, who wrote Darwin on Trial. And since writing Darwin on Trial, has written a number of other books. And this is kind of a fighting book called An Easy to Understand Guide for Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. Well, this is a book, The Tower of Babel, which is for defeating intelligent design by opening minds. And this is The Tower of Babel. It's a book by a philosopher at the University of Texas, The Evidence Against the New Creationism. Now, this is a very thorough book, but the people whom he is still attacking are the old creationists. He mentions these new intelligent design people, but a great deal of what he has to say really doesn't apply to them. Anyway, Philip Kitcher, a professor of philosophy at the University of California at San Diego, says, Robert Pinnock has produced a lucid, accessible, sensitive, and complete refutation of the latest emanations from the creationist camp, and all open-minded citizens should be grateful. So, if you're open-minded, you can get this that attacks Philip Johnson, and you can get Philip Johnson who attacks Robert Pinnock. And both of them assume that you're open-minded if you accept their views. There's some other books that I think would be very helpful going beyond what we've done in this class. And that is trying to find how science and religion can coexist either through a NOMA principle or in some cases through a synthetic principle. For instance, one very good book by John Hott called Darwin, A God After Darwin, A Theology of Evolution. And this is written by a Roman Catholic scholar. There are a number of Roman Catholic scholars who have done some pioneering work on doing a theology of evolution. Well, he obviously is not a creationist in the Henry Morris style, but he is a creationist. He is a creationist who simply believes that the theory of evolution is adequately demonstrated and that therefore theology has to take account of it when it talks about what the Christian faith has to say. This is a delightful book which I just found a few weeks ago called The Fire in the Equations, Science, Religion, and the Search for God, written by Kitty Ferguson, who's been working in England, and she is an independent writer. Among the things she has written are books about Stephen Hawking. And Stephen Hawking recommends this book on the front cover. He says, "A clear account of the ultimate question." Stephen Hawking has, interestingly enough, a number of evangelical Christians working with him. And they are always having dialogue on what the relationship between science and evangelical Christianity should be. I'm not talking about liberal Christians. I'm talking about evangelical Christians who work for him and who carry on a continuous dialogue with him. But this is a book I would recommend for good summer reading, by Kitty Ferguson. Then there's another book called Portraits of Creation, Biblical and Scientific Perspectives on the World's Formation. And it's edited by Howard J. Van Til. Now, Howard J. Van Til is what, until a few years ago, would have been called a fundamentalist. He, of course, considers himself to be an evangelical. But he's an evangelical who, just like Haught and some of these other people, accept the theory of evolution as adequately proved, and therefore, from his perspective, even evangelical Christianity, not liberal Christianity, but even evangelical Christianity has to take into its thinking the fact that there's been an evolutionary process by which the world has come about, but particularly that there's been an evolutionary process in terms of the origin of the species. And they believe that human beings have fully participated in that evolutionary process. So here are 4 evangelicals, that is, people who are basically in the same wing of Christianity that Henry Morris is, but who accept the theory of evolution. And on the back is a recommendation by one of my favorite theologians, Langdon Gilkey, formerly of the University of Chicago. Langdon Gilkey was a theologian who testified at the Arkansas trial against the law requiring equal time or balanced treatment between creationism and evolution. And he says about this book, "This is the best book to my knowledge on the relation of modern and contemporary natural science to the biblical accounts of creation. Written largely by respected scientists who are also committed Christians, it provides a historical account of developments in geology and astronomy, as well as a clear statement of the present themes in each. The book also examines and evaluates the scientific method through which theories about the physical cosmos have been gained, and it articulates a stunning criticism of creation science. Finally, a constructive comparison between of the scientific method with the biblical account is proposed, offering a synthesis." Now notice that word synthesis, which is a bad word for Gould, but evidently it's not a bad word for Langdon Gilkey. "Offering a synthesis of the 2 approaches in which neither one is sacrificed, but rather each perspective is given its due weight and significance. Few volumes on this issue have achieved such a useful and exciting synthesis." Now, I underline the word synthesis because this underlines what I was talking about when I was talking about Gould in his development of the NOMA allows for no synthetic work. And in a sense, that is transgressing his own boundaries, NOMA boundaries, because it's possible, and a great many good theologians who accept completely the theory of evolution still agree that since evolution and the doctrine of creation are talking about the same thing, there should at least be some places in which they touch. In other words, the doctrine of creation cannot determine the scientific theory, but the scientific theory also cannot by itself be a detriment to the development of a good doctrine of creation. We're going to see that a little later. And you will also note this book that I showed you before, Philip Johnson, is largely an attack on people like Howard Van Til, because Philip Johnson is also an evangelical Christian, and he thinks Howard Van Til and some other evangelical theologians have jumped the gun and they've given too much to Darwinianism, and so he wants to just put a stop to that. Anyway, those are some interesting kinds of things that you might look at. I would also, if you're looking around, look at anything written by a man named Polkinghorne, which is an unusual name, but he's a very well-known theologian and theologian of science in Great Britain. And he's written a number of books, and these books tend toward a synthesis also, even though he accepts completely the scientific method and he accepts completely the theory of evolution. He still believes that there are ways in which theologians can talk about science in a fruitful way. And then there's a very interesting book that just came out by Michael Roos, and I'm sorry I didn't bring a copy of that. But Michael Roos is one of the scientist philosophers, R-U-S-E, who testified at the Arkansas trial, and he is a non-Christian. He is a secularist. He is a naturalist, but he has written a book called "Can a Christian Be a Darwinian?" Now that sets up the question pretty starkly. Can a Christian be a Darwinian? And that's kind of the latest fling in this last year or two of books that are dealing with this subject. And all of these people, Michael Roos and William Dembski and Howard Van Til, are in dialogue with each other. In other words, this is not people that hate each other and they're throwing things at each other. And so Michael Roos wants to write a book called "Can a Christian Be a Darwinist?" Now, talking some more about Stephen Jay Gould and his book, The Rock of Ages, and the NOMA. He says that the net, or the magisterium of science, covers the empirical realm, what is the universe made of, fact, and why does it work this way, theory. So that's a very simple statement by Stephen Jay Gould as what the scientific magisterium covers. It covers the empirical realm. What is the universe made of, fact, and why does it work this way, theory. And from his perspective, religion or theology should not get into that area at all. One thing I would argue, however, is that theology can talk about fact and theory from a different perspective, that is, from the perspective of revelation. In other words, why does it work this way? If you're going to get the scientific answer to that question, you have to operate on the basis of a naturalistic methodology. However, if you believe in God at all, then you probably have some idea that it works that way in some way because of the will of God. Well, obviously that's not going to come from science. That's going to come from revelation or some other source. But that means that maybe he's putting the statement too starkly here, that science deals with fact and theory, and that religion, theology, never deals with fact and theory. That's where I think his NOMA gets in trouble a little bit. And I think this is the area where nobody is doing any discussing these days, which is really the important area. And that is not whether an argument from design can be adequately articulated today, but whether a doctrine of the revelation can be adequately articulated today. Because if we leave science to its own realm, which I think Christians have a tendency to do, to leave science to its own realm. That doesn't necessarily mean that Christians can just stop believing that somehow God has is the ultimate source of the world, and that He's in ultimate control of the world, and that He has some purpose in mind for the world and for human beings, and that purpose will be fulfilled. Well, some of that touches on fact and theory. It touches on things that are not scientifically knowable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are not meaningful. The magisterium of religion extends over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. Well, again, that can be accepted by a theologian if he is allowed to explore ultimate meaning to the farthest extent that he can explore it. And ultimate meaning may take into consideration some doctrine of creation. It seems to me like that one of the things that Gould wants to do, though he doesn't want to admit it, is to deny the validity of any doctrine of creation. Thus, when we must make sense of the relationship between two disparate subjects, science and religion, especially when both seem to raise similar questions at the core of our most vital concerns about life and meaning, we must assume that one of two extreme solutions must apply. Either science and religion must battle to the death, with one victorious and the other defeated, or else they must represent the same quest and can therefore be fully and smoothly integrated into one grand thesis. Well, or one grand synthesis. He may be true about that. It may be true that these are the two extremes. But it may also be true that there are two or three other possibilities in between, and that his NOMA, at least the way he expresses NOMA, may not be the only one. You had a question.
About 2 frames ago, you had something about moral values that religion has to deal with.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Gould deals with genetics in his book, but what would you think of that? Would that be religion's field? Like, would that be? Let's don't give up on the table mics this way.
Are you punching your mic? Okay. Well, he's not hearing you. Let me just repeat the question. I think I can repeat the question. Does Gould deal with genetics, and how does genetics deal with moral values? Is that what you're looking for? Well, that's one of the areas where I think that Gould is too optimistic about how moral values and science can be separated. But he would allow scientists to go to moral values. I don't know which ones he would allow them to go to, but he would allow scientists to try to imbibe some moral values to know how to deal with genetics. In other words, even a modern naturalist still believes that moral values cannot be derived from science. And so he would have to have some moral values, whether he's ever thought about them or whether he's ever seriously studied morality. He will have to operate on some moral values, and hopefully he'll operate on some moral values that are serious.
My question is, does religion have right to interfere with scientists?
Well, no. Religion has a right to interfere with scientists. In other words, scientists are moral beings just like anybody else. So if a scientist, for instance, starts killing off people as a scientific experiment, then it is not religion interfering with science for some moral authority to put a stop to that. So, and the same thing is true with any kind of genetic development. If there's some kind of genetic development that, particularly something that touches on human nature, then Gould would say that scientists need to consult moralists on that subject. Yes?
One of the questions I had was doing Gould because I do anthropology and I want to do religious anthropology. I mean, how would he say about archaeology or anthropology, which deals with the religion? I mean, it's science, but what does he think about stuff like that?
Anthropology as a science? Well, he would consider that to be a science, and from my way of thinking, he would severely limit, that is, from my way of thinking, what an anthropologist of science can study. But I think he's correct in that whatever an anthropologist of religion studies, you cannot use his results as a basis for a theology or a morality or a psychology. For instance, when a sophomore goes into a psychology course and he learns some things about psychology, and he learns, for instance, that some psychologists assume that God is merely the projection of human wishes. Well, a theologian should be able to deal with that subject, but I would suggest that it can be dealt with very quickly and very easily. That is, from the scientific perspective, using the tools of science, that's what God is. God is the projection of human wishes or human desires. But to say God is merely the projection of human wishes or human desires, you have overstepped your NOMA. You've overstepped your magisterium. Because to say that God is merely that is to take away from the theologians their right to explicate the meaning of God, or to even talk about the existence of God. And an anthropologist of religion will find out about a lot of things about people, about human sacrifice, about all kinds of things. But nothing that an anthropologist can find out about human sacrifice can tell that anthropologist whether it is moral or good or beneficial to human beings to offer a human sacrifice. That has to come from some other perspective on the nature of humanity and so forth. Because obviously there are a lot of religious people who thought that there was a great deal of benefit to offering human sacrifice. That's a pretty strong sacrifice. And if people didn't believe there was a benefit to it, they wouldn't have done it. So, in a sense, an anthropology of religion has to, by the very nature of its methodology, be relativistic. But a morality doesn't, by its nature, have to be relativistic. Or an anthropologist can come back and tell me about a group of people who are still offering human sacrifice. And I have the right to say, well, just because that is a scientific occurrence doesn't mean that it's morally right. And I have a right to explain why I think that it's not morally right. The fact that human beings will have a tendency to do that, and human beings have had a tendency to do that throughout history. That's one thing that Gould is right about. You can't, and this is important for Christians to understand, and I don't know that Gould understands it very well, but it's important to understand that from the perspective of Jewish and Christian theology, you cannot get meaning out of science. You can't get ultimate meaning out of science. Not only that, you can't get ultimate meaning out of history, per se. That's the reason why ultimate meaning in Judaism and Christianity always has to have some relationship with revelation. And that's why I'm saying until these guys introduce the subject of revelation and try to see if there can be a possible doctrine of revelation that will survive modern thought, then there can't be any there can't be any meeting of science. Revelation says that everything that God has created is good. Science can't tell you that. Science can't tell you that anything is created by God. But if there is a God and He has created something, then that something is what scientists deal with. It's just that they only have a methodology that can deal with it from one perspective. Just like grandma, who, when the baby is born, says, "Oh, isn't it wonderful what God has given us?" And the sophomore science major that comes along says, "Oh, no, that's not what happened, Grandma. Somebody had sex, and a sperm and an egg got together, and then it started developing. And 9 months later, out it plops." And the sophomore science major may think that he's made a very profound statement. But the fact of the matter is that it's possible that his grandmother has made the more profound statement. And it's about the same thing. But they're two different methodologies. Yes?
I'm still confused about that genetics question. I've thought of Gould as he would be upset if a theologian came in and tried to interfere with scientists altering genes.
No, I don't think he would. I don't think he would. He may disagree with them, but I think he would consider it appropriate for even a scientist to participate in some way in the NOMA, in the magisterium of morality. And so I think he understands that science cannot determine what is right and wrong. So if there's going to be any determination of what's right and wrong, he just says that science cannot determine fact. I mean, religion cannot determine fact. Only science can determine fact. In other words, a scientist working on genetics can determine that a certain a certain thing can be produced if you alter genes. A scientist can do that. And religionists can't come along and say, "No, you can't do that," scientifically. But a moralist may come along and say that morally you can't do that. Morally you shouldn't do that. That's a different question. Okay, any other questions? No single magisterium can come close to encompassing all the troubling issues raised by any complex subject. See, this is getting to your question. Especially one so rich as the meaning of our relationship with other forms of life. Since every one of us must reach some decisions about the rules we will follow in conducting our own lives, and since I trust that no one can be entirely indifferent to the workings of the world around us, all human beings must pay at least rudimentary attention to both magisteria, of religion and science, whatever we choose to name these domains of ethical and factual inquiry. Progress cannot be impeded indefinitely, and if theology does not yield its former control over the proper magisterium of science, then religion, with all its virtues, will die in a cultural or political explosion destructive to all humanity. Well, I don't know whether that apocalypse is going to be able to be brought about just by a bunch of scientists and religion people arguing. But he gets this sentiment from Andrew Dixon White, who you also read about, who wrote against religious interference with science. And White said, "In all modern history, interference with science in the supposed interest of religion, no matter how conscientious such interference may have been, has resulted in the direst evils both to religion and to science. On the other hand, all untrammeled scientific investigation, no matter how dangerous to religion, some of its stages may have seemed for the time to be, has invariably resulted in the highest good both of religion and science." Now that is quite a statement. All untrammeled scientific investigation, no matter how dangerous to religion some of its stages may have seemed for the time, has invariably resulted in the highest good both of religion and science. You might say ultimately, I guess, but that would seem a strange sentence in the light of some of the scientific experiments that were conducted in Nazi prisons and so forth. But anyway, the point is that the man is correct that when religion has dealt with science in a way that shows ignorance and has not dealt with science in the way that allows for the magisterium of science to have its own methodology, then there have been dire circumstances. One of those dire circumstances is that because of this, there are now so many people who see no relevance or no hope for religion at all. When scientific conclusions have been denied on grounds explicitly identified as religious by supporters of a contrary view, the subjects involved almost always cut closest to the psychological bone of our deepest hopes and fears, to such questions as, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Now, while he has brought up the subject, what is man that thou art mindful of him, I want to turn to page 178 in Stephen Jay Gould's book, because this is one of the places where Stephen Jay Gould, immediately after setting up the separateness of the NOMA, of the different magisterium, turns right around and tries to do biblical interpretation. And he does a lousy job. He's trying to interpret Psalm 8. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. And then he says, this is followed by the false construction of nature. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea. Now he considers this to be a horrible scripture, a horrible statement from the Bible, because it doesn't take into account what scientist has proved or what scientist says from his perspective. Because what scientist says from his perspective is that human beings have no superiority over the animals. Human beings and all animals are basically from the same root, and so any judgment about their superiority from the scientific perspective is out of place. Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. Any judgment of the moral superiority of human beings has to come from where? It has to come from theology or morality. It has to be a matter in Christian theology of revelation. In other words, it's obvious that science, using his methodology, cannot make a statement like this. But this is not a scientist making the statement. This is a psalmist. When it was first discovered how expansive the galaxies were and the universe was, some people thought, well, this does it. This proves that the Bible has no meaning, that the Christian faith or the Jewish faith has no ultimate meaning, because the world is so big. Look at the world, how big it is. How can something this big have anybody in it who is concerned about human beings? Well, that's the same question the psalmist asked. Only he's not asking it in order to get some kind of a scientific answer. What is confused here, what Jay Gould is confusing, is a scientific statement with doxology. Anybody know what doxology means? There's a difference between a doxological statement and a scientific statement. A doxological statement says, praise the Lord, for he has created us. Or praise the Lord because he has created such a wonderful heaven. And in fact, the fact that he has created this wonderful heaven and all of these moons and stars and the great galaxies and the great universe, what is a human being that God would even be concerned with us? But he's not asking whether God is concerned with us. He assumes that God created us as well as the universe, and he assumes that God is concerned with us. So he's just praising God for that fact. In other words, this is not a scientific discussion. And so my concern is that as soon as Gould tells us that theologians are not supposed to discuss scientists using the methods of theology, he turns right around and discusses theology with the methods of science. In other words, this statement may be true or it may not be true, that God is concerned about us and that God has put us over the animals in some way to care for them and to be stewards of them. That may or may not be true, but you can't learn whether that's true from science. That I agree with him. But you might learn that it's true through some other methodology. You might learn that it's true through revelation. You might learn that it's true through an attempt theologically to understand the nature of God. Yes?
To put it back to a theological aspect, could they not, could theologians not say to him to counter that, as big as the world could be, how could there not be a God? I mean, if they're he's going to take that into scientific aspect.
Well, that's basically what I'm saying. The same scientific fact can be used by a naturalist as an argument against God. But the same scientific fact can be used by a theist as a declaration of the goodness of God and the greatness of God. It doesn't prove his existence. Nobody in the Psalms is trying to prove God's existence. They're operating under the assumption that God exists. They're not trying to prove that God exists. And they're also not trying to prove that human beings have superiority over animals. They know that because of what they believed has been revealed to them. There's no doubt that if you're just looking at science, there is no moral basis for saying that a human being is more valuable than a cockroach. If that's what Gould is trying to say, then that's unexceptional. That's true. There's nothing based on science itself that can say that a human being is more valuable than a cockroach. What you have to do is try to find out by what judgment you make as to what a value is, or what's valuable and what's not valuable. And that's not a scientific statement. And the same thing is true about human beings. Science cannot say that human beings were created to worship God. And a naturalist will not say that, even if there was some scientific evidence to back that up. A naturalist cannot say that as a naturalist. On the other hand, someone who believes in God, someone who has a theistic view of the universe and believes that God created the world, that would be a quite natural thing for him to say. Again, going back to our psychology, Freud said that God is the projection of our human desires. And he also said that religion, or that God is a crutch. He said that religion was a disease and God is a crutch. Well, he thought he had pretty good clinical evidence that religion was a disease. And he probably had lots of evidence that religion was a disease, because the only people that ever came to talk to him about religion were people who were diseased. But on the other hand, there might be some religion that's not diseased. But the fact of the matter is, whether or not religion is a disease or not, the idea of God being a crutch is a bad idea depending on whether there's a God or not. Whether it's a good or bad idea depends on whether there's a God or not. If there is no God, then having God as a crutch is a bad idea. If there is a God, then having God as a crutch is a good idea. Doesn't that seem reasonable? In other words, if you believe in God, and if you know what God is that you believe, then you should hope that He would allow you to use Him as a crutch. Of course, if you don't believe in God, as Freud did, then you don't want any of these crutches. Yes?
If the placebo medication is working, then why stop taking it?
Well, elaborate on your question.
Just that. If you're using God as a crutch and there's no God, then it's better to believe in God than to not believe in God. Well, the worst that can happen to you if there's not a God is you just die.
Well, of course, Freud and Feuerbach and other people of his same persuasion understood that human beings could not live without some kind of religion. What they intended was that a humanistic religion of some kind take its place. And so but that's another entirely complex subject that we probably can't get into. But the point I'm making is if there is no God, then it is a disease to depend on Him. If there is a God, then depending on Him would not be a disease at all. And so that's one place where Freud didn't stay in his magisterium. There are a lot of other places where Freud didn't stay in his magisterium. Yes?
Crutch disease thing almost sounds like Pascal and Wager, that if you believe in God and there's no God, oh well, but if you believe in God, then there is a God, you're a lot better off than the people who didn't, and
Yeah.
kind of sorry.
Well, yeah, that's Pascal's argument, and some people still use it. It's usually not an argument that has much effect on someone who doesn't believe in God. It may be an argument that kind of shores up a believer's faith, but the fact of the matter is that people who don't believe in God generally are fairly courageous people, and they assume that they're more interested in believing the truth, even if it's not helpful to their psychology, not helpful to their emotions. The factual conclusion that we last shared common ancestry with ape-like ancestors some 5 to 8 million years ago does scare the bejesus out of many folks. I guess you found that word in the dictionary. It does scare the bejesus out of many folks who haven't grappled with NOMA and who fear, listen to this sentence now, and who fear that nothing other than the divine creation ex nihilo might rob human life of a special status necessary for personal equanimity in a world of frequent tragedy. Now, what's wrong with that sentence? He's crossed that line again, hasn't he? He's crossed that line again. He can't keep off that line, because these people that I showed you before, the one who has written God After Darwin, the one who has written Portraits of Creation, the one who has written The Fire in the Equation, all of these people agree with Gould on the NOMA. But they also all believe what? Guess what? Creation ex nihilo. In other words, Gould is not yet acquainted enough with Christian theology to know that you can believe in creation ex nihilo without being a scientific creationist. And so as he goes through his book, he drops these expressions in which show that he has not yet he does not yet know enough about the doctrine of creation to know how it relates to science. He should read Langdon Gilkey, the man that he testified with at the Arkansas trial. Langdon Gilkey wrote one of the best books on creation called Maker of Heaven and Earth, which was named after the, and I've given you that before, but I'll give it to you again, and that book is no longer in print, but if you can find it, you'll have one of the best books on creation, Maker of Heaven and Earth. And if Gould had just got Langdon Gilkey, who was his friend, to have read this manuscript before, then he wouldn't have fallen into those traps. Yes?
It also seemed like he took evolution as a factual basis throughout most of the book. That
Yeah, he
didn't
did.
treat it as a hypothesis or a theory.
Yeah, he is definitely going to assume that evolution, that some form of evolution, that is some form of natural descent, in which human beings have participated as well as other animals, is a scientific fact. He also talks about the theory of evolution, but the theory of evolution is a theory about how the fact of evolution has occurred. So that's the way he would distinguish between fact and theory. The fact of evolution, he says, there's no doubt about it. Anybody who has an open mind and who knows anything about science agrees, he says, that evolution is a fact. The theory, Darwin's theory, Gould's theory, something, that still may be in dispute.
Yeah, I'd like to add on that. At one point in the book, he says that if your religion demands you to believe that the world was created 10,000 years ago, then you're crossing the line of NOMA, because it's obvious that evolution is the way the world was formed.
Yeah. Okay, see, now that gets a little bit stickier. Is he crossing the NOMA at that point? There's a way you can view it to say that he, even at that point, is crossing his line. Because he may argue that science should not be expected to take seriously a religious perspective that says that the world is only 10,000 years old. He can argue that. And therefore he can argue that this theory should not be taught in public schools because it is not accepted by the general public. But again, he probably ought to quit sniping across the border. He probably ought to quit shooting at these people, because it's possible, philosophically, it's possible that the world was created 10,000 years ago. It's possible philosophically that the world was created yesterday, or that the world was created this morning. I wouldn't want that to be taught as science in my public schools. But we still ought to leave the people alone, who happen to believe that. There are still people in the United States who believe that the earth stands still. There are probably still a few people who believe that the earth is square. We shouldn't allow those people to teach science in public schools. In other words, there ought to be some way to weed those people out. And people who argue that the earth is only 10,000 years old probably should be weeded out as science teachers. But on the other hand, Gould does not have the methodology to determine whether that is true or not. Yes?
One thing I thought was funny when I was reading this book and just reading other things in the class, it was funny to me how the people, if you agree with them, then you're open-minded. But if you don't agree with them, then you're closed-minded and you're not. That just was funny.
Well, that's the way it always is. you ever watched a political debate recently? Okay, any other questions? I will say this, that a book like this by Robert Pinnock, The Tower of Babel, The Evidence Against the New Creationism, even though I agree with his basic tenet, he really doesn't take his opponent seriously enough. In other words, he thinks of Dembski and these other guys as doing the same thing, except a little bit more in a little bit more sophisticated way than Henry Morris and the 10,000 year early Earth creationists. I mean, late Earth creationists. And that's not really fair, because there is room in academia to discuss these issues. And if Dembski and his boys are correct, they're going to be able to produce enough scientific evidence to make this at least a minority position that is respected within the realm of science. I don't know that they're going to be able to do that. I'm certainly not as good a scientist as they are, and I'm also not as good a scientist as the people who say that they're a bunch of bull. But the point I'm making is that you can't just cut off the debate by just calling people names and saying they're closed-minded, especially if they can write a good sentence and present a thesis and present evidence for it. Even if you don't allow it within orthodox science, it's still in an area where orthodox science has no reason to meddle. And so perhaps we've got the same problem whenever this debate goes on. We have Christians who are scientists meddling where they don't belong, but we often have naturalists who are scientists also meddling where they don't belong, and actually forming conclusions and writing those conclusions and teaching their conclusions to their students as if these were scientific conclusions. There may be no evidence that the world is designed, but you can't be a Christian and not believe in some way that the world is designed. And so at least people ought to be able to go to the limit in their exploration of this. You may not consider that what they're doing is amenable to scientific methodology. So maybe they just ought to do it at their own schools or whatever. But still, the debate is not settled on everything having to do with theory of evolution or having to do with the doctrine of creation. So there's going to be continually debate on this issue. Yes?
Just for a question, the ones like, throwing in scripture and things of that sort, do these scientists, have they seriously looked at theology and studied the Bible, or are they just picking they think, hey, I can kind of pick on this and just kind of pick it and choose it? Because they expect us to learn all that, without even going into the Bible.
Yeah, that depends on the individual. Most of the books that we've read in this course have been written by scientists. And so obviously they are scientists who have some understanding of theology. Gould is not necessarily to be condemned because he's not a good theologian or because he's not studied theology very much. All I'm saying is that it lends itself to a little bit of inconsistency when he admits that he's not a theologian, admits he doesn't know much about the Bible, and then takes 2 or 3 pages to try to interpret a theological idea. In other words, if that's not his magisterium, then let the theologians interpret those scriptures and those theological ideas. That's right. That's right.
Did you notice how he ended some chapters with amen and he would say, "Oh Lord," and
Yeah.
I mean,
He wants. One of his main themes is that he really appreciates religion. Well, maybe it is, but we'll leave that judgment up to him. Let me do one thing here in the last few minutes that we have, and that is just go over some of the basic ideas that we've covered. The course objectives have been to understand how the Bible has influenced the development of science, to understand how science has influenced biblical interpretation, and to critically examine contemporary theories on the relationship between the Bible and science. And we obviously haven't done that in a thorough way. If you're going to take a graduate course, you would have to do a little bit more reading. You may not believe it, but you'd probably have to do a little more reading and a little bit more writing. We talked about what the Bible is. It's the primary document, a primary document of Western culture, basic to the understanding of the Western philosophical, literary, and cultural and scientific traditions. And in that light, we looked at a thesis, and this has been the major thesis of our course. The Bible contains no modern science. But the Bible does contain a worldview, presuppositions, perspective, without which modern science could not have, or at least did not develop. Now, we've looked at that question directly and indirectly all the way through this course. And one of the things we've noticed is that modern science once belonged to religious people. It was a long time after modern science developed that anyone who was not a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim was involved in modern science. And so the idea that modern science came out of some kind of foreign ideal and fought Christianity for supremacy is just a complete misunderstanding of history. All of the original scientists were Christians. And that didn't change for a long time. So the question rises then, why did modern science arise in these areas rather than in other areas? And the conclusion we came to that, based on the research of lots of different people, both Christian and non-Christian, is that modern science arose out of Western culture because Western culture had the ingredients, the non-Greek ingredients, without which modern science could not have developed, namely the Christian doctrine of creation. And that's the reason why we went to the book of Genesis, to see how the Christian doctrine of creation actually sets the stage for the later development of science. Now, science was not developed in the Bible, and modern science was not developed in the early history of the Christian faith. But what we're saying is that without the biblical perspective, and without the perspective of early Christianity, especially in its fight to overcome Aristotle, modern science could not have developed. Carl Sagan, we quoted, I think, the first class period. The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be, is not a statement that any of the original revolutionaries of modern science would have made. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, on down the line, even Darwin would not make this statement. But if they did make the statement, they would realize that it was not a scientific statement. but that it was a philosophical statement. In fact, if somebody at the time of Newton had written this statement, they would have had to have fought Newton, because Newton would not allow that to pass as a scientific statement. We also looked at W.T. Stace in Religion in the Modern Mind, which was very important. And he said, the famous conflict between science and religion is commonly thought of in terms of supposed contradictions between particular dogmas of religion and particular discoveries of science. But his conclusion is, and this has been a conclusion that I don't think we have found much evidence to refute, no scientific argument, by which I mean an argument drawn from the phenomenon of nature, can ever have the slightest tendency to either prove or to disprove the existence of God. In short, that science is irrelevant to religion. Well, that's kind of a basis for NOMA. That's kind of a basis for science having its own magisterium and theology having its own magisterium. But Stace does not go on, as some modern naturalists do, to then try to establish from what they know about science that it's very unlikely that there is a God. And if there is a God, then he must be a horrible ogre, because look at all the little animals that feed on other little animals, and so on. The problem is that a great many modern naturalists think that they are the first person to discover the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering. Darwin did not discover the problem of suffering. If you read Gould, and he talks about nature, he brings out every instance he can of showing that nature is cruel, that nature cannot be evidence of a good God designing anything. And a Christian theologian just has to sit back and wonder, does Gould not know that Christian theology has been dealing with that problem since its beginning? That Jewish theology has been dealing with that problem since its beginning? Of course, the problem of suffering is a very difficult problem for any monotheism to manage. The suffering of one innocent child is the most potent argument against the existence or the goodness of God that there is. You don't have to have 3 children suffering. You don't have to have 1 million children suffering. You don't have to have millions of children suffering like we do in order for this to be an argument against the goodness of God. Just the suffering of one innocent child is the most potent argument against the suffering or the goodness of God. So Gould and some of these other scientific writers like Dawkins seem to think that we've never heard of this problem if we are theists. We've never heard of this problem. And so if you just hear enough about this problem, then of course you will lose your assurance that there is a good God out there. What Christian theists, even Christian theists who accept evolution, would say to that is, we knew that. We knew that Darwin didn't discover that. We knew that nature had some horrible aspects about it. Not only that, but we knew that human nature had horrible aspects about it. And human beings do more evil than insects do, because human beings do moral evil, and insects don't do that. So a human being torturing another human being is much more an argument against the goodness of God than one beetle being tortured by another insect. So we know the problem. The problem has to be dealt with theologically, and theologians have ways to deal with it. A naturalist may not accept those ways. They may never even heard them. They may never even given them any consideration. But that's not their magisterium. In other words, the point is well taken. A theologian who believes in God and who believes God is good has to deal with the problem of suffering.
Looking at it that way, then, evil, because they do moral, right? They cause moral problems or whatever. And the same thing of talking about how other animals eat on other little animals or whatever. Doesn't that kind of solidify the special the specialness of man? For the fact that he was not, they say, well, everybody's equal. But there's so many things that man does and thinks, and that fact that these little animals aren't thinking, doesn't that solidify the position of special creation?
That underlines part of the problem that naturalists have when they don't understand the history of Christian theology or understand the biblical worldview. The Bible worldview talks about the majesty and the sinfulness of human beings. In other words, that human beings are made in the image of God, so they are essentially good, but they are also sinners, which means they are existentially evil. They do bad things. The reason why, I pointed this out before, the reason why Calvinists had an easier time accepting Darwin's theory of evolution is because they already knew human beings were sinners. They didn't have this Victorian idea that human beings were angels. They had the idea that human beings were sinners. Human beings are not fallen angels, and they're not rising apes. They are humans made in the image of God, and they're sinners. And so Asa Gray, the Calvinist, had no problem in recognizing the horror that exists in nature, and even the horror that exists in human nature. He already had a doctrine for it. It was the doctrine of suffering, it was the doctrine of evil, it was the doctrine of sin. So these are not new issues that Christianity has to deal with. But science, if it's going to stay to its own magisterium, needs to allow Christian theologians to deal with that issue. And they may not be able to deal with it. They may not be able to answer it. But science certainly can't answer it. Science certainly can't answer, is there any purpose in all of this mess? Is there any meaning in all of this? It just looks like there's not. That's the reason why Christianity and Judaism says the only meaning for this mess must come from beyond. If there is no beyond, then there remains no meaning for this mess. If there is no beyond, if there is no meaning that breaks into history and gives human beings meaning, then the only way we can get an idea of meaning is from science. And science can't give us one. Yes?
Well, wasn't Gould putting human value judgments on these animals? I mean, animals don't have they don't sin. One's killing another one to survive, the survival of the fittest.
Now, he was actually going farther than that. He was putting value judgments on God. In other words, if you believe in God, he believes, if you believe in God, then you've got a real problem, because this God creates insects that eat other insects from the inside. Do you want to worship a God like that? See, so he's actually making a moral judgment on the character of God. Well, that is an issue that Jews and Christians and others have had to deal with for thousands of years. What is the moral character of God? That's the whole purpose for the writing of the book of Job. Job, when he began his suffering, had a theology which was not adequate to human experience. He believed that if you did everything good, then God would treat you good. If you did something evil, God would treat you evil. What he discovered is that that's not true, that his theology was full of holes. So one of the things that had to happen to Job was his theology had to be completely destroyed, and he had to be left kind of naked there without a theology. But then, if he was going to build a new theology, it had to include the problem of suffering. In other words, he never doubted God's existence, but he was worried about God's goodness. And if he's going to continue to worry, if he's going to continue to believe in the goodness of God, according to Job, it's going to have to be through trust. That's the only way it can be, through belief, through faith. And the magisterium of theology deals with faith. Theology is not faith. Faith is not theology. Theology is our attempt to understand faith and what it is. It's our attempt to understand how we're being saved from the perspective of Christian theology. Science has nothing to say about that. And so I would agree with Gould. It ought to quit trying to say something about that. That doesn't mean a scientist cannot also be a theologian. You know, scientists are welcome to be theologians, and theologians are welcome to be scientists. But the scientific methodology will go this far and no further. And there may not be a God, but if there is a God, the only way you can deal with him is through some other methodology. And you must take into consideration some conversation between God and human beings. Otherwise, even theology can't determine what meaning there is in existence.
With that, can't you make the statement that we should be thankful, from a Christian perspective, you should be thankful that there is no proof? Because if there was proof, then there would be no reason for faith. And faith is the central point of salvation.
Yeah, I think here Gould and other scientists and other Christians who are also scientists are right in that Christians do not want to give scientists and historians the power or the methodology by which they can determine the truth or the falsity of theological statements. For instance, if you're going to be a Christian, one of your basic beliefs, besides the existence of God, is in the incarnation and the resurrection of Christ. Historical science, physical science, anthropological science, psychological science can have nothing to say with whether that's true or not. And so Christians should not be trying to use scientific methods to try to prove it, because other people then will be open to using scientific methods to try to disprove it.
What I think is, just like the heliocentric theory, like it was denied at the time because of the scriptures, but eventually there was proof, so even the church started to agree with it. I think the same thing is going to happen with evolution. If there is proof, then they will alter their translation of the Genesis to fit evolution.
Well, that's one of the points that Gould makes. In fact, he uses the papacy, the popes, as an example of how Christians ought to relate to the theory of evolution, because the Roman Catholic Church, including the present Pope, has opened up the study of evolution and the acceptance of evolution completely for Catholic scholars. But he still believes in creation, and he still believes in creation ex nihilo. He just believes that a doctrine of creation and a doctrine of the existence and the goodness of God can be shown to be compatible with any scientific theory or any scientific fact that can be presented. And if it's not compatible, then there must be something wrong with the science, or there must be something wrong with the theology. What?
Which brings us back to God.
Yeah.
But I mean, how does it affect the Christian faith or their beliefs how the world was formed? Does it really matter how the world was formed?
Well, that's the conclusion all of us have to come to for ourselves. There are some people that it does affect their belief. There are some people that it doesn't. And we're about to come to the close of our series, and I really appreciate everybody's participation. Does anybody want the last word or the last question? Yeah.
The fact, going back to the faith idea, and that you're saying that some people it affects their faith or whatever, then from that point you have to question, how strong is their faith if just because it wasn't created as they kind of thought it was. You have to go back to a strong faith is the central issue of Christianity or any religious theology rather than science.
I would say, just to kind of conclude, that Christians who are still afraid of science and have problems with relating to science ought to consider the fact that God is a little bit bigger than we often think of him, and that it's possible that he could be responsible for everything that a scientist can discover. And that's really the way the early scientists felt. And so I think that's a good note to end this on.